I'm Mike Marx, and I've got very smart people up here with me, and we're going to have a discussion. And this started off as let's do something interesting in one of the breakout sessions. And some of the most interesting times I've had at NAED meetings over the years have been in the bars. I don't know why that is, but some of the best conversations have been in the bars. So essentially what I've done is I managed to get some pretty smart people, and I said, let's not talk as representatives of companies. We've all been in the industry for a long time. Let's be industry insiders. And instead of talking about where Eli was talking about where the economy's going and everything yesterday, let's talk about where we think the industry might be in 20 years or 25 years or 15 years or just sometime after the next recession. And so speaking as industry insiders, what we're going to do is we're just going to try to figure out what are the things that are sort of moving around and going to change us. And the goal here, just so everybody here knows, there aren't any magic answers, obviously. We may come up with some interesting questions, but the whole purpose of this dialogue is to take everybody in this room, myself included, and maybe get outside of our own little sandbox of how we look at the world and maybe start to think about some things that are perhaps a bit different. I think we're going to find that we're all optimistic about the long-term future of the industry. I think it's just going to look very, very different. So I'm going to ask, we'll start with my friend Barry, and I'm going to ask my panelists to introduce themselves just a little bit about sort of who they are and how they ended up in the industry, and then we'll just start talking about where we think it's going to go.
I'm glad to be here. Actually, I'm president and CEO of VanMeter, Inc. We're headquartered in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. We're an electrical wholesaler. I've been in the distribution business for 20 years. Prior to that, I worked for Square D for 10 years. I got out of school, and it was the early 80s, and the market was very difficult, and Square D came to campus and said, we got a job for you. And my first role was, and most of my role at Square D was in manufacturing. So I started out in the off shifts working in punch press and some of the heavy metal areas, and actually got to a point with Square D where I was traveling all the time and never home, and I answered an ad in the paper 20 years ago for a little company called VanMeter Electric Supply Company. And I remember the stark difference between being a manufacturer and being a distributor.
I can't wait.
As a manufacturer, you had all of this resource and all of these different people and all of these different departments that served you and helped you. And I can remember my first day at VanMeter, my boss saying, okay, it's time to make decisions. Is there anybody that will check me on those? Well, no, just make the right ones or you won't be here. So I remember that clearly and that difference. So I'm glad to be here today. Thank you.
Dominic?
My name is Dominic Pileggi. I'm the CEO and chairman of Thomas & Betts. And Michael was just asking me how I started at Thomas & Betts. And it was the spring, I think, of 1971. I went down to visit my uncle, who was a salesman for Thomas & Betts. I didn't know what he did. I actually was down there and a car broke down and went down to visit him. And I said, what do you do? And he was a salesman for Thomas & Betts. And he had a car, and he was able to hang out with us all day. And I said, I know where I want to work, So I started with Thomas & Betts in 1979 as a salesman in Philadelphia, and just went through various jobs, and here I am.
Kathy, it's your turn.
Your uncle must be very proud, though.
Yeah.
Anyways, I'm Kathy Mazzarella. I am the Executive Vice President, Chief Operating Officer of Graybar, and President-elect. I'll assume President and CEO position June 1st. Been with Graybar 32 years. It's the only job I had, basically, is working for the company. Started when I was 19, and my story is very different. I had dropped out of college, and needed to find a job. I had moved in with my parents, which didn't last long. Anybody who has kids that come back home, there's about a 3-day period where you really like each other and then you need to move on. So I went to live with my parents, and I didn't know the area. Went on a job interview, got lost, and was going to look for a job at Genetech. Got lost, went into a building to ask for directions, and the switchboard attendant asked me if I was there for the jobs. I go, yeah. Took a test, and 3 days later I was hired at Graybar as a CSR. So never thought I was be in this industry, didn't know what the industry was, and just been a privilege to be in this industry. So. But I did think I'd have to work. So.
She started on the distributor side. I'm Mike Marx. I first got involved with NAED back in 1989. I was doing the sales and marketing part of the executive development program at Texas A&M that NAED was very supportive of. back in 1989, I remember doing a speech at one of our meetings. I don't remember where. This is back in the Randy Goldrick days for the old people in the room that might actually remember. But we were talking about value-added distribution, and Wesco was owned by Westinghouse, and there was no international companies, you know, the Graybar and Granger, these are the big guys. And what made us unique back then, what made us unique, and everybody was, oh, the other thing, we also had buying groups. We didn't even have IMARC. It was still WEED and TID and all this kind of stuff back in the day. But the way all the distributors won is we sold service and we had excellent people, and that's how we won against all the other distributors. That's kind of where we started, and things are maybe perhaps a bit different now. I was trying to add it up this morning, we've done probably 30 sizable consulting projects in this industry and probably 100 overall projects. Sizable is like, you know, months and months and effort. So we've got a number of non-disclosures, and I've told everybody here, and some of you that are looking at me, that on my next to last day in the industry, I will violate all the non-disclosure agreements, but not today. So what we're going to talk about is the future of the industry, and I think one of I'm not sure which one, because there's so many places to start. But I guess the first thing I would just sort of ask my panelists in terms of, let's start with globalization and consolidation, because if I think back to '89 when I did that, you know, a foreign country was going to Toronto, right? I mean, it was, and it's so different today. And so what's sort of some of the ideas that you folks might have about how it's going to keep changing?
You know, if you think about globalization, if you start with that, and I think it's really just starting, and you know, you talk about that being a futuristic trend, but it's actually a present trend. And what's happening in globalization is, even if you're a domestic, you know, local distributor, it's touching you, whether it's on how you export your products and all the new rules and regulations you have to deal with. It's touching you with the risk that you have to take doing it, or your suppliers are now international suppliers that come in with different sets of rules, different specs, all kinds of things. And I think the most critical part of that, you know, we've sat through lots of meetings this week, and one of the common themes that all the distributors that were talking to us about is the need for talent, people that they could bring into their company, and people that can understand what's happening on a global basis, even if it's how to deal with your suppliers, or how to deal with your exports, or you know, how to deal with Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, so you don't accidentally get your whole company in trouble. So I think that trend is something that we all live with, even though if it's not directly, even if you're not going overseas all the time. So.
Well, but from what you're saying, it's not necessarily good or bad. It's just different.
Yeah, you just have to know how to deal with it. And you have to have the right kind of people in your organization that understand it. You deal a lot more with lawyers when you do international business because of contracting and freight and all the inventory issues. So I think it's a trend that's here now. It's not, you know, we talk about that being futuristic, but we're in it.
It just in my experience, we've been doing a fair amount of work in Asia and India and EMEA, you know, taking a look at distribution, and we actually ran into a distributor in the People's Republic of China, sizable company. I mean, it was under $100 million, but I mean big. The median age in the company was 23. And it was so different. I knew it was an electrical distributor. I could recognize some of the brands, but it was just a lot of different flavors.
And I bet they were all multilingual.
Actually, they weren't multilingual, because they said if they were multilingual, they would have worked for a multinational, right? And if they're not multilingual, then they work for a distributor. And so you can't make this stuff up.
Wow.
You know?
We have like comedians on the panel.
I know.
Yeah.
So it just, I'm still trying to figure out where it's all going to go, but I do think it's going to keep changing. So
I do too. The trend is, if you look at what's driving a lot of the infrastructure build from a global basis, it really is the growth of the middle class, and I do have that statistic. When you look at the last 20 years, the population in the world grew only 700 million people. But in the next 20 years, they're looking at the population growing another 3 billion. And most of the 3 billion coming into the population will be in countries outside the U.S. and are really going to be increasing the pressure on the middle class. And as countries develop middle class, what do they need? They want people who they consume. They need homes, they need infrastructure, they need buildings, they need schools, they need all that type of stuff that those of us in the U.S. Take for granted in many cases. So that's one of the trends I think that will continue to drive it. I do think technology is another one that's enabling a global supply chain. But with a global supply chain, you create a lot of risk. We saw that with the tsunamis, right? Where supply was actually, many of our suppliers, I don't know about all of you, but a lot of our suppliers had product shortages, basically because they couldn't get the raw materials because they had only sourced in one country. So the concept of the supply chain being more agile will be important from a global perspective, while distribution still is a local business. So that combination of having a flexible technology that would enable you to have a global network but still have a local relationship is the challenge of distributors.
Make that really crisp, because that was really important what you just said.
You want me to repeat what I just said?
I'm not sure I got, because you said something about you had to be global, but it had to have the local.
Absolutely.
How does that go together?
Well, in essence, when you look at a lot of the customers that we have today, they find the growth outside the U.S. When you talk to a lot of customers, especially if you're in the industrial space, right, or if you're in the large commercial space, whether you're in insurance, dealing with insurance, bankers, whoever it is, right, they view the world from a global perspective, as well as the manufacturers. And so what they do is they typically will come to a distributor, and I'm sure you all have this, where they'll say, we want you to provide the same level of service for us that you do in the United States in ABC country, wherever it is. Right?
Got it.
Well, in order to do that, you need to have a technology system generally that will allow you to do that, or you're going to have to look at a different business model, because typically people that have facilities in other countries, and correct if I'm wrong, they want to do business with people from their country, right? And so if you come in and you fly in a bunch of Americans into China to run it, chances are you aren't going to be as successful unless you engage people that are from that country. But you want to take advantage of your infrastructure skills, your technology skills, and everything else to provide that consistency.
So it's the framework, but you still go back to the local relationship.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And you also then you have to have a mindset for partnerships, which we're not really used to.
Right.
So you go into that country, now all of a sudden you have a partner that plays by totally different rules and has totally different mores than you do, and so you have to be able to deal with that. And sometimes your system is your common thread.
Mm-hmm. And I think globalization provides tremendous opportunities for distributors who are awake and really thinking about their future in a different way. You mentioned, Dominic, the whole pursuit of talent. I think many times, it's easy to sort of set the reset on experience over talent. And I think what we have to be able to do is to find, maybe put the talent filter ahead of experience and make sure that we're finding somebody who really is diverse in thinking, who can bring us ideas as distributors that we might not traditionally think about. Because, when you start to look at this connected world, I think there are tremendous opportunities for distributors to find niches, to find product fits around the world that they can apply in their own markets. And part of that, I think, requires us to have a workforce who gets up in the morning and thinks differently about our future than perhaps we have in the past.
Well, back in '89, when I first started hanging out with these folks, the Rexel Sonopar, their presence in the States was like non-existent. Mm-hmm. And kind of what I'm hearing you say, and are a lot of the distributors in this room, if you go forward another 20 years, we've seen so much change to now, are the local distributors going to be following their customers overseas? We're going to have, can you be an independent and not be an intergalactic guy and have an office in Bangladesh?
I absolutely think you can. And I think you have to first know who you are. But as you develop relationships with customers who, broaden their approach, and if you're willing, I think, Kathy, you said it, you have to have that dynamic and flexible technology platform. If you can do that, and you've got people and diverse people who are willing to take those chances with you, I think there are tremendous opportunities with that.
I do think an area of concern, and we're pretty cautious when it comes to investing because we are employee-owned. So we tend to take a more conservative approach to expansion and risk, is the other thing is when you go into another country, whether it's through an alliance, we do a lot of alliances or teaming agreements and things like that with companies in other countries, is you have to go into it with a mindset that you're going to probably lose money for a while. Right? And for those of us that are in distribution, we know our margins are pretty slim. So you have to be willing to write off a portion. Perhaps not. Maybe some folks can go right in and make a lot of money. But the business dealings, I know, like in China, it's very, very challenging to make money in China. We've looked at a bunch ourselves. We've looked at companies out there. We've looked at a variety of different business models out there. And you have to just be willing to put in the time and the money and the investment and be willing to understand that the risk profile when you do something outside the U.S. border or even North America is going to be much higher than what you may be accustomed to, and build that into your business modeling as you look to go into another country.
I think that's the risk factor is really important, because you also, you hear a lot of people pound on their chest that they're going global,
right.
And that's usually never the answer. So you have to think about, what's the rifle shot approach? Where would you go? Because you can't invest everywhere, right. So you have to make that investment and get your return on that investment. So you kind of have to figure out where the action is, and that's where, to your point, maybe you're going to follow a customer that gets you started there into the faster growing emerging markets than just saying, we're going global.
Well, and in a way, following that customer is also a defensive move.
Absolutely.
Because I've invested all this time and effort. They're like one of my top 10 accounts, have been since dirt, and I'm going to go wherever they're going to go.
That's right.
But also take into account, like you said, when you start looking at Foreign Corruption Act rules and guidelines, when you go into another country, the regulations and rules are completely different country to country. But as U.S. corporations or companies, based in the U.S., you're still held to U.S. standards and rules and regs. And so really understanding the sophisticated nature of the transaction sets. You're going to need attorneys, for sure, a lot of attorneys, whether you want them or not, to make sure that you keep yourself out of trouble. Because a lot of behavior that's in the other countries, where you have a consultant who's your brother that you're paying in order to write the design or whatever, those types of things in the U.S. can get you into trouble, prison, fines, or whatever else. So again, that balance, that would be the only other caution I would say, is make sure that you know the rules and regulations, not just the U.S. requirements when you go into another country, but whatever the operating procedures are in the countries. And then bringing money back into the country is another thing you need to look at. Based off your business model, can you bring that money back into the U.S. or not? What is going to cost you to bring it back into the U.S.? And again, does your business model, would it support it? Are you willing to leave that money in a country? We looked at a distributor in Argentina, and that's a pretty volatile area. And the big challenge there was, as soon as you put money into that country, the government takes X% off the top of whatever your investment is. And this distributor says basically you have to leave it there. You can't take it back out. So those are the kind of things, depending on the countries you're working with, right?
And you also, when you do that, you talk about places like Argentina, you really have to understand the safety of your employees.
Absolutely.
That's a whole your responsibility to make sure your employees are safe when you're sending them into these far-flung places of the world. So that's a whole other kind of training and a whole other kind of investment. And then you'll usually work with some kind of agent. Well, you could be the most honest and done all your homework, but if your agent is breaking the law, guess who's responsible? In the eyes of our government, you go down with your agent. So you have to keep all of those things in mind.
The other side of globalization, we've been talking about expansion that way, into a world market. I think there's tremendous opportunities for distributors who stay on the ground here in America to really open their eyes and ears to bringing new products, into our market. I mean, if you start thinking about alternative energy, there are countries that are far ahead of America in that, and there are products out there, lots of different products overseas that I think a heads-up distributor can find and add to their portfolio.
I was amazed. That's spot on. We've spent a fair amount of time in EMEA just seeing how far the European countries are ahead of us in terms of alternative forms of energy and wind generation and geothermal and the electronic equipment that you need to make all that work. There's a whole array of stuff.
Driven by their energy rates, right?
Exactly.
And I think it would be hard to argue that our energy rates ultimately won't go up in this country as well as we think about that.